The summer of 1945 brought Europe a fragile calm that barely masked the devastation of 6 long years of war. Cities lay in ruins, millions had perished, and entire populations struggled with hunger, disease, and displacement. Yet amid the rubble, in the city of Potsdam, just outside Berlin, a gathering was about to take place that would determine the shape of the post-war world. It was not a ceremony of victory, nor a celebration of triumph, it was a meeting of calculation, negotiation, and cautious optimism. The stakes could hardly have been higher. Europe had been liberated from the grip of Nazi Germany, but the questions of punishment, governance, and reconstruction remained unresolved. At the heart of it stood 3 men, each carrying the weight of their nation's ambitions, insecurities, and vision for the future. Harry S. Truman, newly sworn in as President of the United States after Franklin Roosevelt's untimely death, faced a world he had barely known. Unlike Roosevelt, who had cultivated personal relationships with European leaders over years of war diplomacy, Truman had to assert his authority quickly, learning the subtleties of alliances, military strategy, and international expectations on the fly. He arrived in Potsdam determined to demonstrate that the United States was now fully engaged in reshaping the world, not merely providing support. Truman understood that moral authority alone would not be enough. America's growing military might, particularly its recent development of the atomic bomb, would soon add an unspoken pressure to every negotiation. Joseph Stalin, representing the Soviet Union, had endured the greatest human cost of the war. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had died defending their homeland, and the Soviet economy was in tatters. Yet Stalin came to Potsdam with a mixture of cautious pragmatism and firm resolve. He had already ensured Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, and his priority was to consolidate these gains while securing reparations and guarantees to rebuild his country. Stalin's presence was both a reminder of the human toll of the war and a clear message that the Soviet Union would not compromise on matters it deemed essential to its national security. His negotiating style, blunt and unyielding, contrasted sharply with Truman's more measured approach, setting the stage for the delicate dance that would define the conference. Britain's representation underwent an unusual transition during the meeting. Winston Churchill, the wartime prime minister whose speeches had rallied a nation under siege, began the conference with the weight of Britain's experience on his shoulders. Yet midway through the discussions, Churchill's party lost the general election, and Clement Attlee, representing the Labour Party, replaced him. This unexpected shift reflected the changing political landscape in Britain. While the nation had survived the war, the electorate demanded social reform and a new domestic agenda. For Truman and Stalin, the change added a subtle layer of complexity, as they had to gauge whether Attlee's priorities aligned perfectly with those previously communicated by Churchill. Despite the political shuffle, the British delegation remained determined to influence the post-war order, balancing the need for European stability with the evolving social contract at home. From the outset, the conference was characterized by a mixture of urgency and careful restraint. Though Germany had surrendered, its future was uncertain, and the Allies needed clear strategies to prevent a resurgence of militarism. The conversation quickly gravitated toward the so-called 4Ds: denazification, demilitarization, democratization, and decentralization. Leaders debated how best to implement these policies without destabilizing the delicate balance in occupied zones. While all agreed that Nazi leadership must face justice, the scope of trials, the administration of former military and government officials, and the role of local populations in governance required intricate negotiation. Truman, guided by principles of democratic accountability, pressed for a transparent approach that would prevent abuses, while Stalin emphasized the need for security and reparations to rebuild the Soviet Union. The interplay of idealism and pragmatism defined the early hours of Potsdam. The issue of Germany's territorial restructuring was equally contentious. Eastern European borders had shifted dramatically during the war, with millions of civilians uprooted, and millions more facing potential displacement. Stalin advocated for clear recognition of Soviet control over regions east of the Oder-Neisse line, while Truman and the British sought to balance Soviet security interests with humanitarian concerns. Every discussion had a human dimension: how to manage the migration of displaced populations, how to restore civil administration, and how to prevent renewed conflict among the occupying powers. The complexity of these negotiations was amplified by the ongoing suffering on the ground. Cities such as Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin were still littered with rubble, and millions of Germans faced starvation and uncertainty. Leaders were forced to confront the harsh reality that reconstruction would be as difficult as the victory itself. While the focus was on Europe, the shadow of the Pacific War loomed large. Japan had not yet surrendered, and the Allies were preparing for what was expected to be a prolonged and bloody campaign. The conversation in Potsdam was layered with strategic calculation: how to pressure Japan into unconditional surrender without provoking unnecessary civilian casualties, how to coordinate military efforts with minimal Allied friction, and how to signal to the world the emerging authority of the United States. Truman, newly aware of the United States' nuclear capability, recognized that the impending introduction of the atomic bomb would fundamentally alter diplomatic leverage. Yet even as he contemplated the weapon's implications, he remained focused on the immediate demands of the conference, aware that Europe's stability could not be delayed for events in the Pacific. The human element of the conference cannot be overstated. Long days of negotiation were punctuated by tense exchanges, quiet diplomacy, and moments of subtle humor. Delegates navigated cultural differences, ideological clashes, and personal temperaments, all while attempting to project unity to a world eager for stability. Truman's forthright style occasionally clashed with Stalin's methodical deliberation, yet both understood the necessity of compromise. Attlee, representing Britain's domestic priorities, reminded his colleagues that Europe's rebuilding must also reflect the social needs of ordinary citizens, including housing, healthcare, and employment. Behind closed doors, every word was weighed for its implications, as missteps could reverberate far beyond the conference rooms of Potsdam. By the close of Chapter 1 of the Potsdam story, the stage had been set for a series of decisions that would shape the next decades. The war had ended in Europe, but the seeds of post-war order, potential conflict, and global diplomacy were being sown in real time. The leaders of the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain faced a world in transition, devastated, uncertain, and brimming with possibilities. The conversations at Potsdam were not just about borders, trials, or military planning; they were about principles, trust, and the future of civilization itself. Every agreement reached, every compromise made, and every tension observed foreshadowed the world that would emerge after 1945, a world seeking balance between power and morality, between security and freedom, and between ambition and responsibility. In this opening chapter, the human cost of war, the pressures of leadership, and the fragile alliances of victory converged to create a story of immense complexity. Potsdam was more than a city on a map; it was a crucible where history was forged, where ideologies met reality, and where the decisions of a few men would ripple across continents for generations. The world watched, often unknowingly, as the foundations of the post-war order were laid in quiet rooms and on long tables, where paper, pens, and human judgment attempted to contain the lessons of 6 years of unprecedented conflict. Decisions, tensions, and the shaping of Europe. The days following the initial meetings in Potsdam saw the city become a center of intense activity, where every corridor, every room, seemed charged with the weight of history. Unlike the explosive battles that had recently scarred Europe, the struggles here were subtler, fought with words, documents, and the strategic placement of ideas. Leaders were acutely aware that the choices they made now would echo far beyond the conference hall, influencing not only Germany but the wider geopolitical map. With Europe fragile and countless lives at risk, negotiations had to balance justice, security, and practicality, a task made all the more complicated by the stark differences in ideology and immediate objectives of the Allied powers. The question of Germany's punishment dominated the opening sessions. Stalin, unflinching in his demands, insisted that the Soviet Union receive substantial reparations to rebuild cities, industry, and infrastructure devastated by the Nazi invasion. The sheer scale of destruction had left the USSR in a precarious position, and Stalin was determined to ensure that Germany could not threaten his nation again. Truman, representing a United States increasingly assertive on the world stage, acknowledged the need for reparations but cautioned against measures that might cripple Germany entirely. He argued that a balanced approach would prevent resentment and future conflict. British representatives, now fully under Attlee's leadership, advocated for a plan that also considered humanitarian relief, fearing that an overly punitive strategy could exacerbate the suffering of ordinary Germans, many of whom were already displaced or starving. Debates over Germany's political future were equally intricate. Denazification was a priority for all, but the methods and scope sparked disagreements. Truman pushed for a transparent judicial process, emphasizing the importance of fair trials for Nazi officials to set a precedent for international justice. Stalin, though agreeing in principle, stressed efficiency over procedural fairness, fearing that prolonged trials could allow former leaders to regroup or undermine Soviet security. Attlee, balancing domestic pressures with international responsibility, sought assurances that local governance could resume under democratic frameworks, particularly in regions where Allied occupation had yet to establish full authority. Discussions oscillated between legal theory and practical administration, revealing the delicate interplay of ideals and immediate necessities. As negotiations continued, the question of territory emerged as a flashpoint. The redrawing of Europe's map had already displaced millions, and leaders recognized that any decision would carry profound human consequences. Stalin advocated for recognition of Soviet influence over areas of Eastern Europe that had fallen under Red Army control, viewing it as a security buffer against future aggression. Truman and Attlee, while acknowledging the realities of military occupation, emphasized the need to respect national identities and prevent forced population transfers whenever possible. Every statement was carefully parsed, diplomats spoke in measured language, fully aware that the press, intelligence networks, and even the movements of refugee populations could react to any hint of change. Meanwhile, the issue of Japan's surrender added another layer of urgency. Though geographically distant, the Pacific War was a constant presence in discussions. The Allies were determined to secure unconditional surrender, but the anticipated costs weighed heavily on their minds. Truman, newly aware of the destructive potential of the atomic bomb, was already considering its role in compelling Japanese capitulation. Stalin, eager to expand Soviet influence in Asia, pressed for early recognition of Soviet interests in territories such as Manchuria and Korea. Churchill and Attlee, concerned with both the ethical implications and the strategic balance, contributed to discussions aimed at coordinating military pressure while avoiding unnecessary civilian casualties. The conference thus became a platform where global strategy intersected with moral and political deliberation. Throughout these days, tensions simmered beneath a veneer of diplomacy. Stalin's insistence on firm control over Eastern Europe clashed subtly with the Western vision of self-determination and economic reconstruction. Truman, balancing America's emerging role with humanitarian concerns, occasionally found himself at odds with both Stalin's pragmatism and Italy's focus on domestic social priorities. Yet even as disagreements surfaced, moments of quiet consensus emerged. Agreements were forged on administrative procedures for occupied Germany, the handling of industrial assets, and the coordination of Allied military zones. Each concession, each compromise, reflected not weakness but a careful calculation of what was feasible in a world still reeling from devastation. The human element of the conference remained ever present. Delegates, military advisors, and interpreters navigated cultural nuances, temperamental differences, and personal ambitions, all while working under the scrutiny of history. Truman, still acclimating to his role on the global stage, displayed a combination of resolve and pragmatism that gradually earned respect from seasoned counterparts. Stalin's presence was formidable, yet his occasional humor and directness offered rare glimpses into the mind behind the iron discipline. Italy, in contrast, often served as a moderating influence, reminding the other leaders of the broader consequences of their decisions on ordinary citizens across Europe. These interactions, subtle and complex, underscored that history is as much a product of human temperament as it is of policy or principle. By the midpoint of the conference, the broad contours of Europe's post-war order began to emerge. Decisions regarding the division of Germany into occupation zones were finalized, laying the groundwork for the eventual political landscapes of East and West Germany. Administrative structures for cities and regions devastated by conflict were established, and mechanisms for supervising demilitarization and denazification were agreed upon. The Allies also reached preliminary agreements on the handling of displaced populations and the allocation of reparations, though details would require further negotiation and oversight. These arrangements, though technical in nature, carried profound implications for the millions affected by war's destruction. At the same time, discussions on Japan sharpened, with the issuance of the Potsdam Declaration looming. This statement, demanding unconditional surrender and outlining the consequences of refusal, would become a critical instrument in shaping the final stages of the Pacific War. The declaration reflected a careful balance. It signaled Allied resolve, communicated the moral authority of the victors, and simultaneously left room for Japan to act before facing further devastation. Within the conference halls, these deliberations were charged with urgency, as all parties understood that the Pacific conflict would not only determine Japan's future but also influence the broader balance of power in Asia. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, it becomes evident that the Potsdam Conference was far more than a meeting of victorious nations. It was a complex negotiation where ideology, strategy, morality, and pragmatism converged. Every decision, from territorial adjustments to the administration of Germany, from reparations to the planning of war crimes trials, carried consequences that would extend well beyond the immediate post-war period. The conference revealed both the potential for cooperation among global powers and the seeds of future tensions, particularly as differing visions for Europe's political and economic reconstruction began to crystallize. The outcomes of these days would not only shape the map of Europe but also lay the foundation for the political dynamics that define the second half of the 20th century. The ripples beyond Potsdam. The air in Potsdam had grown heavy with tension, not the explosive kind that marked the battlefields of Europe, but the quiet, pressing weight of responsibility. Outside the conference rooms, Berlin lay in ruins, and the lingering smell of smoke and rubble reminded the world that victory came at a staggering cost. Within the walls of the palace, the leaders of the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain faced questions that extended far beyond immediate military concerns. Decisions taken here would reverberate across continents, shaping nations still struggling to recover, influencing political movements far from Europe, and setting precedents for a world eager to avoid another catastrophe. The conference, while ostensibly focused on the defeated Germany, quickly revealed itself to be a microcosm of the emerging global order. As talks progressed, attention shifted toward practical implementation of the agreements. The division of Germany into occupation zones, once a theoretical line on a map, required detailed planning and cooperation among the Allies. Military governors and civilian administrators were dispatched to enforce policies, manage resources, and ensure stability in a country fractured by war and ideological divisions. The task proved daunting. Infrastructure had collapsed, supply lines were disrupted, and millions of refugees wandered through cities and countryside alike. Truman and his advisors emphasized efficiency and fairness, striving to balance security concerns with humanitarian needs. Stalin, while focused on rapid extraction of reparations, also recognized the necessity of maintaining order, understanding that chaos could undermine Soviet influence and prolong suffering. While Europe absorbed the immediate consequences, the Pacific theater demanded attention with equal urgency. Japan had yet to surrender, and the Allies faced the daunting prospect of a protracted campaign that could exact enormous civilian and military tolls. Truman, newly acquainted with the power of the atomic bomb, recognized that its imminent deployment would redefine strategy and diplomacy. Even as diplomats debated logistics and occupation, the shadow of unprecedented destructive capability influenced every discussion. Stalin, for his part, pressed to expand Soviet influence in East Asia, particularly in Manchuria and Korea, viewing the region as both a strategic buffer and a site of future geopolitical significance. British leaders, concerned about colonial holdings and global credibility, sought a balanced approach, aiming to ensure Allied cohesion while respecting regional sensitivities. Amid these pressing logistical and strategic concerns, the human dimension of Potsdam's decisions became starkly evident. Millions of Germans faced starvation, displacement, and uncertainty. In Eastern Europe, populations were uprooted to accommodate shifting borders and Soviet expansion, creating waves of refugees that would affect communities for years. Allied administrators, tasked with implementing the conference's resolutions, often encountered the tension between ideological goals and the practical needs of everyday survival. Food shortages, destroyed housing, and disease outbreaks demanded immediate attention, even as policies for political restructuring and reparation collection were being enforced. The interplay of moral responsibility and practical governance became a defining theme of the post-conference period. Beyond Europe and Asia, the Potsdam Agreements began influencing political movements worldwide. In Asia, nationalist leaders interpreted the conference as a signal that colonial empires were vulnerable and that international principles could support aspirations for independence. In India, leaders cited the Allied emphasis on self-determination as a moral justification for accelerating demands for sovereignty. Across Africa and the Middle East, similar sentiments emerged, where the language of consent and cooperation introduced at Potsdam became a touchstone for emerging nationalist movements. Although the original discussions had focused on European reconstruction, the reverberations were global, reshaping expectations for governance and human rights in regions far from the negotiating table. The question of accountability for wartime atrocities also took center stage. The framework for prosecuting Nazi leaders was being transformed from abstract principle into operational reality. The groundwork laid at Potsdam accelerated plans for the Nuremberg trials, where concepts of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against peace would be codified into legal precedent. This aspect of the conference underscored a critical evolution. The Allies were not merely victorious powers dividing spoils but institutions attempting to create an enforceable system of justice. The trials, though focused on Germany, carried implications for international law and governance for decades to come. Despite these advances, tensions persisted beneath the surface. Differing visions for Europe's political and economic order became increasingly evident. Stalin's insistence on Soviet influence in Eastern Europe contrasted with Truman's emerging vision of democratic reconstruction and free market principles. British priorities, influenced by domestic social reform, occasionally conflicted with both American and Soviet strategies. The conference revealed the beginnings of a geopolitical fault line that would later crystallize into the Cold War. What had started as cooperative reconstruction increasingly included elements of mistrust, as each power assessed not only immediate goals but also long-term strategic advantage. Communication and media also played a role in extending Potsdam's influence. Newspapers and radio broadcasts across the world began reporting on agreements and negotiations, often emphasizing the moral dimensions of the conference rather than its procedural details. For citizens in war-torn regions, the coverage offered a mixture of hope and caution: hope that stability and justice would follow the horrors of war, and caution that the implementation of agreements would be complex, uncertain, and sometimes uneven. In many ways, the conference became as much a psychological event as a diplomatic one, shaping public perception and expectations alongside policy. The final days of Potsdam were marked by both resolution and anticipation. Agreements on administrative control, reparations, and governance of Germany were formalized, though many operational details remained to be negotiated on the ground. Preparations for the Potsdam Declaration, aimed at Japan, were finalized, reflecting the determination of the Allies to secure unconditional surrender. Amid these formalities, the personal dynamics between Truman, Stalin, and Attlee continued to shape outcomes, demonstrating that history is often molded not only by documents but by human judgment, temperament, and intuition. As the conference drew to a close, its legacy was already beginning to unfold. The immediate impact on Germany was profound. A divided nation, administered by competing powers, faced a complex program of reconstruction, justice, and political restructuring. The broader implications for global politics, however, were even more significant. The frameworks and tensions that emerged in Potsdam foreshadowed the international order of the second half of the 20th century. The seeds of cooperation, competition, and ideological division planted in those weeks would guide diplomacy, conflict, and policy for decades to come. In the end, Chapter 3 demonstrates that the Potsdam Conference was more than a meeting of victorious nations. It was a turning point where wartime alliances began to transition into peacetime strategies, where moral imperatives intersected with pragmatic governance, and where the world's most powerful leaders began to grapple with the complex realities of shaping a global order in the aftermath of unprecedented destruction. The decisions taken, the compromises forged, and the tensions revealed during these days extended far beyond the walls of Potsdam, shaping not only Europe's recovery but the trajectory of global history itself. Aftermath and the birth of a new world. As the leaders departed Potsdam and returned to their nations, the real work of translating agreements into reality began. The city's grand halls had witnessed the final arrangements for Europe's reconstruction, but beyond the formalities lay the enormous task of implementation. Germany, devastated and demoralized, was no longer a battlefield but a laboratory for policies that would shape the continent's political, social, and economic future. Administrators and military governors moved quickly to occupy, assess, and control zones, while millions of ordinary Germans struggled to navigate the chaos left behind by 6 years of conflict. The decisions made in Potsdam had immediate consequences, setting in motion a complex interplay of power, ideology, and human endurance. The division of Germany into American, British, Soviet, and later French zones created both opportunities and challenges. Coordinating governance across occupation zones required delicate diplomacy among powers that had already begun to diverge in their visions for the country. Truman's administration prioritized democratization and economic recovery, believing that a stable and prosperous Germany would prevent the resurgence of extremism. Stalin focused on extracting reparations to rebuild the Soviet Union, while consolidating influence over the eastern part of the country. British administrators, balancing limited resources with the need to maintain order, emphasized public welfare and the restoration of basic services. Every decision, from food distribution to infrastructure rebuilding, involved intricate negotiation, as competing priorities and scarce resources tested the Allies' ability to work together. One of the most significant challenges was managing the human toll of war and occupation. Refugees, prisoners of war, and displaced persons required urgent attention. Millions were living in temporary camps, struggling with malnutrition, disease, and uncertainty about their future. Local authorities, often operating under directives from multiple Allied powers, faced the daunting task of organizing food, shelter, and medical care while simultaneously enforcing policies for denazification and demilitarization. These efforts highlighted a crucial reality: policy on paper was only as effective as its execution on the ground. Administrators had to navigate local tensions, scarce resources, and a population traumatized by years of violence, making the task as much humanitarian as political. The prosecution of Nazi leaders advanced rapidly after the conference. The groundwork laid in Potsdam accelerated the planning and execution of the Nuremberg trials, which would set an unprecedented legal precedent. For the first time in history, individuals were held accountable not just for crimes committed against other nations but for crimes against humanity itself. Judges, prosecutors, and investigators faced immense challenges, including gathering evidence in a continent shattered by conflict, locating perpetrators, and establishing legal definitions for acts that had previously lacked international recognition. The trials symbolized the Allies' commitment to justice and provided a moral framework intended to guide future international law, influencing conventions and tribunals for decades. Meanwhile, the Pacific War reached its decisive moments. The Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, represented the culmination of diplomatic and military strategy discussed during the conference. Japan's initial hesitation prolonged hostilities, leading to the United States' use of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These events, while intended to end the conflict swiftly, also introduced a new dimension to global politics: nuclear power. The bomb's use transformed strategic calculations and established the United States as a dominant force in the emerging post-war order. At the same time, Stalin moved quickly to assert influence in Asia, occupying territories that would later shape the political landscape of China, Korea, and Mongolia. Potsdam's legacy, therefore, extended far beyond Europe, reshaping the balance of power across the globe. The conference also influenced broader geopolitical alignments. While cooperation had characterized the wartime alliance, ideological differences became increasingly pronounced in the post-conference period. The Soviet Union's insistence on control in Eastern Europe contrasted with American and British priorities for democratic governance and free market recovery. Disagreements over reparations, political structures, and economic policies revealed the contours of a new tension that would later crystallize into the Cold War. Potsdam, in hindsight, represented the transition from a wartime coalition united against a common enemy to a peacetime rivalry defined by competing visions for global order. Diplomatic cables, intelligence reports, and public statements in the months following the conference reflected both the collaboration achieved and the frictions that would dominate international relations for decades. Economic reconstruction, too, became a defining feature of the post-Potsdam era. The Allies recognized that stability required more than military control. It demanded functional economies capable of sustaining populations and preventing social unrest. Plans for rebuilding transportation, industry, and agriculture were developed in conjunction with occupation policies, emphasizing efficiency and long-term viability. In Germany, these programs sought to balance reparations with recovery, a delicate task given the diverging priorities of the occupying powers. In broader Europe, the principles discussed at Potsdam influenced the creation of frameworks for international cooperation, laying the groundwork for institutions that would later facilitate trade, finance, and diplomacy in a recovering world. Beyond politics and economics, the human dimension of Potsdam's decisions shaped societies in profound ways. Millions of people across Europe experienced both immediate relief and enduring disruption as borders shifted, governments changed, and new systems of law and order were implemented. Refugees were resettled, former Nazis were removed from power, and citizens navigated the complexities of occupation, governance, and rebuilding. The psychological impact of these measures was as significant as the physical reconstruction, as communities redefined themselves in the wake of war. In many regions, the conference's agreements became the basis for new social contracts, influencing education, civil rights, and civic engagement in ways that extended far beyond the immediate post-war years. By the end of 1945, it became clear that Potsdam had set the stage for a transformed world. Germany, divided and administered by four powers, became a symbol of both the promise and the challenge of post-war reconstruction. The trials of Nazi leaders established international legal norms and a moral precedent that would resonate for generations. The Pacific War concluded with consequences that reshaped global military and diplomatic strategy. And the ideological divides between East and West, emerging clearly during the conference, foreshadowed decades of political, economic, and military competition. Potsdam's legacy, therefore, was not limited to policy, it extended into the very fabric of global order, influencing governance, law, society, and strategy in a rapidly changing world. Ultimately, Chapter 4 underscores the lasting significance of the Potsdam Conference. What had begun as a meeting to address immediate post-war concerns evolved into a blueprint for managing the complex aftermath of global conflict. The conference demonstrated that leadership is not measured solely by decisions in isolation, but by the ability to navigate competing priorities, human suffering, and long-term consequences. Through the implementation of agreements, the shaping of policies,